On now to the next item of business, which is a business motion 23231 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, which changes decision time today. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Minister. The question is that motion 23231 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. So we're going to move on now to topical questions. And just to remind members, we've actually put aside an hour, up to an hour, for topical questions today, and there are 5 questions. First question is from Keith Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with the UK Government regarding the conditions under which furlough payments will continue to be made in Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
Well, ministers and officials have pressed vigorously with our UK Government counterparts on a number of occasions in recent days to ensure that the conditions under which furlough payments are being made in England will continue to be paid in Scotland. And we continue to seek urgent clarifications from the Treasury as to the exact terms under which the furlough scheme will be available to us.
Keith Brown.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer? In the weekend just past, many people in Scotland lost their jobs and some lost their businesses. They did so because the one thing the Tories had been clear about was that furlough would not be extended. That position, of course, was supported by Tories in this chamber. The continuing uncertainty as to when and under what circumstances furlough will continue to be paid in Scotland will continue to cost jobs and close businesses. Does the Minister agree with me that in addition to the Prime Minister's view that £1 spent in London is of more value than £1 spent in Strathclyde, it now appears that every action of this Tory Government supports the view expressed by one Tory MP that a job in Scotland is, to this Tory Government, of less value than a job in the south of England?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I agree with Keith Brown that this boils down to a very simple question. Does the Prime Minister and does the Chancellor place as much value on a business in Scotland and a job in Scotland as they do on a business or a job elsewhere in the UK? The UK Government wouldn't budge when we asked for furlough to be extended, or when Wales asked, or when Northern Ireland asked. And now, at the 11th hour, before furlough was due to end, it was extended. Why? Because England was going into lockdown. The lack of clarity and the total confusion that appears to reign at the very top of the UK Government isn't helping Scottish businesses plan, it isn't protecting jobs, and the detail needs to be clarified immediately. We need full furlough available to Scottish businesses when they need it, full self-employed income support, and we need to ensure that when the support is required, it is there for Scottish businesses.
Keith Brown.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary again? And given the shambolic conduct that she refers to of the UK Government in extending a scheme that they said they would not extend merely hours before it was due to end, the farcical and twice delayed hasty press conference in Downing Street, the different versions of UK Government policy expressed by the Prime Minister, the Housing Secretary, various Tory MPs and MSPs, and most recently by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, what actions can the Scottish Government now take to get the UK Government to speak with one clear voice, guarantee furlough at 80% in Scotland if and when it is required, and thereby to halt the disgraceful destruction of Scottish jobs and businesses that the Tory Government and the supporters here in this chamber are responsible for?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as the First Minister said, woolly words don't save jobs, and I have asked for 4 meetings since Saturday night with the Chancellor or the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to give them the opportunity to clear up this issue and provide clarity once and for all. That meeting hasn't been granted, one suspects, because they still don't know what their own position is. I also suspect that the Scottish Tories are getting a little taste of the contempt in which Scotland is held and are starting to see and experience what we see and experience on a regular basis, which is a UK Government that blows in the wind, that U-turns on its U-turns, and that still, 3 days later, still can't give a straight answer on whether Scottish businesses are of the same value in the Chancellor's eyes as English businesses.
Colin Smith, to be followed by Willie Rennie. Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When the Scottish Government published its strategic framework, the Hospitality Protection stated that non-food pubs would be able to open at level 2 and 3, albeit with varying restrictions on where and when they could sell alcohol. But on Friday, with not even a hint in Parliament the days before, the Government published regulations that closed all non-food pubs in level 2 and 3. Now, I understand why the Government did that, to allow non-food pubs to access the new closed job support scheme that was supposed to come into effect this week. But given the fact the UK Government has eventually agreed to extend the original furlough scheme, which is paid to businesses irrespective of whether they're legally closed or not. Will the government now urgently rethink the regulations it published on Friday and consult with the sector over whether non-food pubs, many of which will have invested a lot of money in safe, open outdoor spaces, may want to open, in particular at level 2, where it might be viable in line with the government's framework you published last week?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we will continue to consult the sector as the member has asked. He's right in saying that furlough being extended for this month reduces some of the pressure on businesses. But in terms of the hardship support, we have tried to ensure that the funding available to us goes as far as possible to help as many businesses as possible. And of course, in Scotland, they can access the hardship scheme support irrespective of what tier they are in, whereas in England, it's only if they are in Tier 2. So we are not able financially to offer local funding packages beyond the grants that have been set out in the strategic framework without further consequential funding becoming available. But if funding does become available, we will ensure that as many businesses as possible get those small grants.
Colin Smith.
I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary's answer, but it's not about the government's grant scheme. It's about access to the furlough scheme. Now, the government published a framework that specifically allowed non-food pubs to open at level 2 and 3. You changed that position on Friday and closed all those pubs because of access to the furlough scheme, not necessarily the government's grant scheme. So I welcome the commitment by the Cabinet Secretary to review those regulations, but can she give an idea of what the timescale is? Because many pubs at level 2, for example, plan to open on Monday, and were told literally minutes before they opened by trading standards they could not do that. We are treating hospitality, frankly, as a scapegoat rather than an important sector that employs nearly 300,000 people across Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for that clarification, which I hadn't picked up in his first question. In terms of our engagement with the sector, as he rightly says, because of the difference between the job support scheme closed or the job support scheme opened, we consulted particularly the pub sector to understand the best way for them to access the support. And it was based on that evidence and those discussions that we made the decision we made when it came to regulation. So there was extensive dialogue in advance. As he says, without any warning, the furlough scheme was extended at the 11th hour on Saturday night, which has complicated matters further. And so we recognise that we need to get the regulations right at the end of furlough if it isn't extended for Scottish businesses. And we will consult businesses in advance of that happening to ensure that the regulations allow them to access as much business support as possible.
Thank you. Willie Rennie to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Does the Finance Secretary think that if we can't get a straight answer from the UK Conservative government soon, that about the future lockdown and the future furlough to support it, that the Scottish government will be forced to lock down Scotland on Thursday?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it's important to state at the outset that the evidence that we use, the 5 indicators that were set out in the strategic framework document, are the basis on which we allocate the protection levels. But the document also makes clear that we are dealing with 4 harms. One is the COVID harm, wider health harms, wider social harms, but critically, the economic harms as well. So we will base our decisions on the evidence. But Willie Rennie makes an important point, because if there is additional financial support available, then it makes it much easier to make certain decisions. And that's precisely why Wales and ourselves have been pressing for an extension to furlough. It has been a lifeline of support. Businesses need it if we're going to mitigate the colossal economic harms that are currently being done.
And Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In her discussions with the UK Government, can she make representations that all businesses impacted by restrictions can make use of furlough? And can she also make representations to make sure it can happen regionally? As Willie Rennie was saying, it would be unacceptable if the whole of Scotland were locked down in order to access this money. But it would also allow for regions where there was a spike of COVID to be locked down without financial hardship, and protect those businesses affected there, as has been put forward in regions of England as well. But I think it's important for regions of Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I agree in principle in terms of there still being gaps in the furlough scheme and indeed in the self-employed income support scheme? It's why at the very beginning we provided grants to those that were newly self-employed who had been left behind. So there are gaps in it and not everybody is helped through the furlough scheme or the self-employed income support scheme. To re-emphasise the point that I made to Willie Rennie, we will make decisions on the basis of the data and the evidence on the state of the epidemic in Scotland, and will continue to make decisions about which levels apply in which area on the basis of public health and clinical advice and assessment against the four harms. The point that has been made consistently is that if businesses are required to close or see their operations impacted, they need as much support as possible because of the sacrifices that they have already made. And that's why, if furlough has been extended when businesses in England are locked down, then it makes sense and it's entirely reasonable to argue that the same support, the same extension of furlough and the self-employed income support should equally be available to Scottish businesses if they find themselves in that position.
Thank you. Question number 2, Sarah Boyack.
To ask the Scottish Government whether the new 5-tier restrictions come with greater funding for local government in areas where more businesses must now close.
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
The Scottish Government will resource in full the business support approach set out in the strategic framework.
Sarah Boyack.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer and ask if she can give some more clarity on that issue, because local authorities are aware of businesses now facing a precipice, because even if they are allowed to open, they may have to operate with restrictions that mean they cannot survive. It's been heartbreaking to hear of small local businesses who have used up their savings to keep afloat in the past few months. Others have already talked about hospitality, but given the success of local authorities in supporting businesses through the first wave, can the Cabinet Secretary clarify what support is actually available from the Scottish Government that could be distributed through local councils once again?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say at the outset just how grateful I am and how much I appreciate the work of local authorities up and down the country. And working at the heart of each local government are officials and employees and staff members who have in many cases gone well above and beyond the call of duty to ensure that grants are processed quickly to provide that support to businesses, and have often worked beyond their allocated work, as it were, to make that happen. In terms of the business support that's available from the 2nd of November, grants will be available for every 4-week period of restrictions, and as outlined in the strategic framework announced last week, grants of either £2,000 or £3,000, depending on rateable value, will be available for businesses required to close by law, and a hardship grant of £1,400 or £2,100, depending on rateable value again, for businesses that remain open but are directly impacted by restrictions. And those grants will be provided regardless of protection level, and more information can be found on the Scottish Government's website, findbusinesssupport.gov.scot, if I remember correctly.
Sarah Boyack.
Can I very much welcome that information from the Cabinet Secretary, which I'll be sure to share with constituents. Can I also say that infrastructure projects will be vital in kick-starting our local economies? So to enable local authorities can start planning ahead now and work with local companies, will the Cabinet Secretary clarify when and how much funding will be available from the £275 million Town Centres Fund to let local authorities get going on that investment, which is crucial to keep our town centres alive?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, when it comes to providing support to local government as part of the £230 million that we made available in June, there was additional funding for regeneration funding as well as the Town Centre Capital Fund. And that will allow local authorities to plan ahead when it comes to infrastructure. And I quite agree with her that infrastructure will be key to providing jobs and to revitalising local government. In terms of the detail and the breakdown of that funding, that is also online in terms of each local authority's split.
Thank you. Willie Coffey, who joins us online, to be followed by Annie Wells. Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Chancellor has committed to open-ended support for businesses in England, essentially writing them a blank cheque. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise whether the Treasury has provided any assurances that funding for business support in Scotland will be similarly open-ended?
Cabinet Secretary.
It's a very important point because for businesses, let's say in Liverpool right now, if they are required to close, the Treasury will continue to provide financial support in the form of grants to those businesses. In Scotland, we are given Barnett funding, of course, but it is very challenging to forecast the costs when we do not know right now how many businesses will need grant support for how long. And therefore, it's important that we can continue to provide support. And that's why I have been asking for two things. One is for a breakdown of the £700 million of guaranteed consequentials to understand what portion of that is for health, what portion is for transport, what portion is for business support. But secondly, to ask for the reassurance that if businesses need more support than will be able to be provided as part of the £700 million, that the UK Government are willing to step in and provide the Scottish Government with the support to provide that support to businesses.
Annie Wells, to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton. Annie Wells, who joins us remotely.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the last week, the SNP Government has already had to U-turn on contingency funding for nightclubs, and there is still some uncertainty over support for soft play centres. Therefore, what will the Cabinet Secretary and her colleagues do to prevent this needless uncertainty in the future and to give more clarity and guidance to our struggling local authorities to ensure that much needed support gets out to businesses as quickly and as efficiently as possible?
Cabinet Secretary.
It is, of course, quite remarkable that a Scottish Conservative MSP has just asked me about U-turns and business support and uncertainty. But in terms of the support available to businesses, we announced several weeks ago that there would be the £11 million contingency funding. That allows a flexible approach to providing support to businesses that either haven't been able to open yet or have seen far more reduced trade. Now, they do not need to apply for the contingency funding. Soft play businesses, nightclubs, local authorities will contact them directly to begin the process of providing them with the support. But of course, they too would value additional clarity and additional certainty from the UK Government, whose U-turn thus far has been quite shambolic.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Shona Robertson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Outdoor events producers have suffered more than most businesses as a result of the restrictions of the pandemic, but they've started to adapt and create COVID-safe events. However, 21cc in my constituency was due to have a safe drive-in fireworks display in Errol at a cost of several tens of £1,000s to the organisation, but they are now having to cancel that event because of the cross-region tier restrictions on travel. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, given that these organisations will not have been insured for COVID-related disruption, will she consider repurposing part of the newly announced Events Recovery Fund to make good the losses on outdoor events producers like 21cc?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for that question, and we do recognise the huge impact on the event sector, and that's why, of course, as part of the culture, creative and heritage consequential funding, we did make £10 million available for the events sector, and there's a number of other schemes available in terms of support. But I think the point he makes is a really important point, which is with the funding that we have been given, it's very challenging for us to ensure that all sectors and all businesses see their lost income replaced. And that's why when it comes to providing support, we're trying to make the funding envelope go as far as possible. So there is support there for the event sector. There is support available for culture organisations. But we appreciate that it won't be sufficient to make up for all the lost income. And any funding that is available to us in the form of consequentials, we're keen to get out the door as quickly as possible to provide that support to businesses and to ensure that jobs are retained.
Shona Robertson, to be followed by Alec Rowley. Shona Robertson.
Thank you. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what discussions the Scottish Government has had with local authorities and banks with regards to the eligibility criteria for the COVID-19 Restrictions Fund, which requires a business bank account to pay funds into if the application is successful, and the issues that this is causing for a number of businesses in my constituency?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Shona Robertson for that question. In terms of engagement, we've worked closely with partners in local government to get the funds up and running quickly, and the requirement for a business bank account is to help manage the risk of fraudulent claims. I'm aware that there has been an issue with banks not opening new business bank accounts due to the volume of the UK Government loan scheme applications received, which has put considerable strain on account opening resources. Fiona Hislop has raised that issue directly with the banks at the Banking and Economy Forum and also with Scottish Financial Enterprise, and I understand that many banks are now opening new accounts for larger businesses and for existing customers who are establishing new businesses. But I agree that that falls some distance too short of the ideal situation, and so we'll continue to press the banking industry to ensure that business owners are not adversely affected by that situation and can benefit from the new scheme.
And Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I saw at the weekend a number of UK Government ministers talk about the levels of funding that they're putting into local government in different ways. So Labour very much supports the call that we need to have detail of the funding coming through Barnett consequentials, and we'll work with the Government on that. But on the levels, different levels within Scotland, I certainly have been contacted over the weekend by a number of companies in Fife and pub owners in Fife who say that they're in level 2 but they would prefer to be in level 3 because realistically they're unable to function, and therefore will they get the same support if a bar says it simply cannot, it's not feasible for it to continue to open?
I thank the member for that question, which is one that has been raised with us in advance of the protection levels coming into place. Now, it's an issue that was somewhat resolved by furlough being extended, because I think the big challenge for pubs was that even if they were allowed to open in Tier 2, if there's a ban on alcohol, then it's clearly not viable for them to open. And there was a risk that they wouldn't be able to access the job support scheme closed, which is more generous than the job support scheme open. So in discussion with businesses and the business industry organisations, it was concluded that it would be easier to mandate closure rather than to allow them open with less financial support. We now have a month's window in order to make sure that the regulations are right, because furlough is in place and the job support scheme hasn't come into place. But we will need to ensure that pubs are able to, and other businesses are able to access the maximum support. Of course, this wouldn't even be a topic of consideration if the furlough scheme is extended, as the Prime Minister said it would be yesterday for Scottish businesses.
Thank you. Question number 3, Ross Greer, who joins us remotely.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it will ensure that the latest guidance on face coverings in school will be implemented.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney, who also joins us remotely. Mr Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I wrote to local authorities jointly with Councillor Stephen McCabe of Cosla last week to emphasise the need to implement updated guidance on reducing the risks of COVID-19 in schools as swiftly and effectively as possible. Effective implementation of the package of measures in our guidance at a local level, including in respect of face coverings, is crucial to ensuring that schools remain open safely. To support implementation in secondary schools, a communication toolkit has been produced and is available on the new Education Scotland Education Recovery webpage. Education Scotland will also be adding examples of good practice to these pages. Our guidance also provides general advice on the local processes that should be followed when there are concerns around implementation of risk assessments and protective measures. The COVID-19 Education Recovery Group will continue to oversee the guidance and monitor its implementation.
Thank you. Ross Greer.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that answer. The clinical advice on the effectiveness of face coverings seems clear. So whilst recognising that this is far from ideal, I do welcome it as a vital step in keeping pupils and staff safe. It's only one mitigation measure, though, and I'm concerned that others aren't happening. We know that social distancing isn't taking place in most schools consistently, for example, but we don't currently know the status of the testing programme. In August, the Deputy First Minister told me that enhanced surveillance testing would be fully operational by October. So can I ask, did that happen?
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Yes, Presiding Officer, the surveillance programme is up and running. There are 30,000 education staff who have registered their interest in participating in the programme, and I'm advised that we have about 13,000 results already as part of that programme. This is, of course, in addition to the fact that we made available the opportunity for any member of staff who is concerned about COVID but does not yet have symptoms, who could, through their employer, be able to secure a test. And that is, of course, in addition to the fact that any member of staff with symptoms is able to get a test whenever they require such a test. So those programmes and those enhanced measures are in place, and obviously we will continue to keep under active review all possible steps to ensure that our schools remain the safe places that they are for staff and for pupils.
And Ross Greer.
Thank you. This morning, the Deputy First Minister responded to a letter I'd sent early last month raising concerns on behalf of vulnerable teachers who'd been pressured to return to classrooms. There's clearly a postcode lottery across the country as to whether home working and alternate arrangements are being seriously considered. His response states that individual risk assessments should take place, informed by the advice from the teacher's GP. 2 teachers in 2 separate council areas have contacted me to say that their GP is advising strongly against their being in the classroom, but their school and local authority have refused alternative arrangements beyond statutory sick pay, which would have an obvious and significant financial impact in the long term. So can I ask the Deputy First Minister for his response to situations such as this, where a GP has advised against the return to work, but alternate arrangements have not been seriously considered?
Cabinet Secretary.
Fundamentally, these are issues for local authorities to determine as in their role as employers of members of staff, and for them to take account of the guidance that has very clearly been put in place by the Education Recovery Group, which draws together the work of government, local authorities, professional associations and a range of education stakeholders. So I would encourage members of staff to engage in those discussions with their employers. If Mr Greer has particular cases about which he is concerned, and he obviously has raised those in the question, if he was prepared to provide me with the details, I will look into them further. But the general guidance I can offer is that the Education Recovery Group's work is focused on ensuring that our schools are safe for all staff in all categories of staff, and particularly staff who have fundamental vulnerabilities in their health within the shielding population. And these issues should be considered individually as recommended by the Education Recovery Group by individual local authorities.
And Jamie Green to be followed by Ian Gray. Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The levels of frustration felt by members over the nature of these announcements is quite palpable. Why did the Cabinet Secretary announce this via press release on Friday morning rather than on a sitting day in Parliament when we had ample opportunity to debate the detail of his guidance? But on the guidance, what impact assessment has he undertaken on this guidance and the effect it will have on pupils with physical health conditions, additional support needs and learning difficulties? And will he publish that impact assessment?
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the Government has to act to ensure that we implement the advice that's available to us at the earliest possible opportunity during a pandemic. And the Education Recovery Group finalised its position on the advice in the course of Thursday. And we obviously have the new tiers framework coming into place on Monday. So my judgment was that we should set out that information timorously, but I am, of course, here to answer questions about the advice to Parliament today. In relation to the specific needs of young people with additional support needs or any other form of issue that would impede their ability to wear face coverings, that is already covered within the guidance in the sense that exemptions are made very clear within the guidance that should be applied should there be any reason why it is inappropriate for a young person to wear face coverings, and other mitigating actions should be taken by schools in relation to those circumstances. And that approach is, of course, consistent with the approach that we generally take on making sure that we take decisions within our education system based on the individual needs of individual pupils.
And Ian Gray.
Thank you. There is a good case for the wider use of face coverings in schools, but Jamie Green is right. This would be a lot easier to support, explain or defend if members had some notice of these decisions. There was no mention of face coverings in schools or consideration of that during many hours of parliamentary time on the 5-level framework last week. The change was briefed and tweeted by journalists on Friday morning. It was confirmed by a press conference at lunchtime, and Parliament was told in an Inspired PQ, which was answered 4 hours later. Indeed, the initial supporting evidence published didn't mention face coverings at all. It really isn't good enough. Will the Cabinet Secretary undertake to do better in future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, I'm reminded of one of Mr Gray's other contributions to some of our recent debates, where he criticised me for not announcing a change to policy on exams quicker, but leaving it to address Parliament several days later. And here we have a situation where Mr Gray is complaining about the fact that I have acted quickly and have come to answer questions from Parliament later. I think it's a glorious example, Presiding Officer, of being damned if you do and damned if you don't in the eyes of Mr Gray.
Thank you. Question number 4, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports that some NHS boards reduced COVID-19 testing for patients over 70 years old on the basis of guidance issued by the Chief Nursing Officer.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
From the 29th of April, patients aged 70 or over are tested for COVID-19 on admission to hospital. This is, of course, in addition to testing policy on discharge to care homes and testing should COVID symptoms develop. Concerns were expressed by the COVID-19 Nosocomial Review Group, whose work had informed this policy, about the ethics and impact of repeat over 70s testing. These being discomfort, distress and risking mucosal damage. As large numbers of repeat tests were resulting in a low positive yield, our Chief Nursing Officer advised boards on the 7th of October that the repeat testing of over 70s was not required unless the person became symptomatic or was part of a COVID-19 cluster or the lead clinician considered it to be necessary. But it was also made clear on the 15th of October that repeat 4-day testing of those aged 70 or over could continue if boards following a risk assessment felt this was necessary and was reflective of current epidemiological evidence.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but it does allow me to once again raise the issue of the role of Parliament and the fact that we don't get much of the Scottish Government information. We get much of our Scottish Government information from the media, be that through the Daily Brief or other media outlets. I do recognise that the Cabinet Secretary has set up fortnightly meetings for health spokespeople, but given the CMO and Professor Jason Leach are so instrumental in how Scotland tackles this crisis, should Parliament not at least have the opportunity to question them directly as part of openness and transparency?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, both the National Clinical Director, the Chief Nursing Officer, the Chief Medical Officer, the Deputy Chief Medical Officers and our other clinical advisers are precisely that. They are advisers. And the decisions that are then taken on the basis of their advice are decisions taken by elected politicians, in this instance, i.e. me. So the opportunity and the appropriate opportunity to question is to question me on those decisions and those judgments. Of course, the advisers have been made available to members, and I am happy that they continue to be made available to members for the purposes of briefing. Our Chief Medical Officer, from memory, attended the last discussion I had with opposition spokespeople, and I'm very happy that we continue to be able to do that, not necessarily Dr. Smith, but it may be others, depending on what we're talking about, to update those opposition spokespeople directly on the state of the pandemic and the thinking and so on. But I think it is really important that we are clear about the role of clinical advisers and indeed other advisers across government whose professional role is to provide that advice to the best of their ability, but the decisions that are then taken, the actions of government, it is ministers, cabinet and the First Minister herself who are accountable for those decisions, and those are the individuals, including myself, that you should question.
Brian Whittle.
Once again, can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and of course she's right that the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government is responsible to this Parliament. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to consider how this Parliament can be kept informed of the decisions that the Scottish Government makes and ensure that this Parliament's place is respected and members don't have to get their information through media outlets?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I think that's a wee touch unfair, if you don't mind me saying so, Mr Whittle. I regularly write to the Health and Sport Committee, of which you are a member, as are others, on issues that we are developing and making decisions on. I'm happy to look at what more I can do in that regard. We also, of course, make sure Parliament is aware through GIQs, and usually those GIQs are accompanied by a letter to the Health and Sport Committee to make sure that it is aware of that. We publish a great deal of information. We're always looking at how we can publish more information. I am always very happy to make statements to Parliament, or indeed to take part in debates in Parliament. If members think there is more that I can do as the Cabinet Secretary for Health to ensure that Parliament is kept absolutely up to date, in addition to what we publish on a regular daily and sometimes weekly or monthly basis, and in addition to what both the First Minister and I already do, then I'm very happy to consider that in the spirit that I want members to be informed, and I want the proper democratic role of this Parliament to be honoured and respected.
Monica Lennon, to be followed by John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. According to Public Health Scotland, more than 1,000 discharged hospital patients were admitted to care homes with a known COVID-19 outbreak between the 1st of March and the 21st of June. Why did Scottish Government guidance issued in March permit this? When did the practice end? And will the Cabinet Secretary allow preliminary work on the public inquiry to begin so that issues like the role of Scottish Government guidance in clinical decisions can be examined both in the interest of transparency and public safety?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'm grateful to Ms Lennon for her question. Some of the detail of the answer that she requires I don't have with me. I'm very happy to provide that, although we have rehearsed this before. In terms of how we go forward, in the statement that I will make shortly this afternoon and that will be issued to opposition spokespeople probably around about now, there are a number of supporting papers, evidence papers, to support that, which includes not only the root cause analysis that I commissioned with respect to care homes and the results from that and the recommendations of that, but also the evidence paper as well as the plan itself. All of those contribute to, along with that independent report from Public Health Scotland and the Universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, all of those contribute to our deepening and developing learning about what we need to do to provide more protective measures, not just to people in care homes, but to those receiving adult social care across a range of settings. And I hope in this afternoon's statement we will be able to rehearse that and have some further discussion on that. And of course, as Ms Lennon knows, there is a further debate on this matter tomorrow.
John Scott, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that NHS Ayrshire and Arran undertook to reinstate COVID testing to the over 70s in NHS Ayrshire and Arran. However, the Cabinet Secretary has confirmed today that this is only happening for new admissions and not existing inpatients who previously were tested every 4 days. With over 75 COVID-infected patients in Crosshouse Hospital alone, should this 4-day testing regime not be fully reinstated and extended to all hospital inpatients as before?
Cabinet Secretary.
So just to be completely accurate, what I said was that the testing of over 70 and over patients who were admitted to hospital continues and has not been stopped and carries on. What we did was respond to the concerns of the nosocomial group, which is a group of clinical and other experts who expressed concerns about repeat testing every 4th or 8th day on the grounds of both ethical and clinical decisions. And we said, in response to that, with the most recent letter that the Chief Nursing Officer sent to boards, is that you are not required to do that, but you should do it if you believe that, if your clinicians think that is necessary, or if you believe that the local epidemiological data tells you about a prevalence of the virus in your area that makes you believe in public health terms that that is a sensible precaution to take. So that decision-making sits with individual boards. And many individual boards, I don't actually have the detail about what Ayrshire and Arran is doing, but I'm happy to send it to Mr Scott. But other boards are continuing with that repeat testing in Lanarkshire and Greater Glasgow and Clyde and others, because that is the view that they take locally, informed by their public health experts and their clinicians. And I think that's the right balance between requiring a national position but also permitting local decision-making where they're on the ground and they know best. In terms of all admissions to hospital, elective patients are tested where they're coming in for elective procedures, and we are working through the delivery plan to test all admissions to hospital in the very near future.
And Willie Rennie.
I'm concerned about the implications of this for families visiting residents in care homes. I hear variable stories about access, with some families still finding it difficult to get in to see their elderly relatives. Can the Health Secretary assure us that this will not have an implication for this? And can she also update us on testing of families to make sure that they do get that access that they need?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'm assuming Mr Rennie is concerned about access for visitors to patients over 70 in hospital as a consequence of this policy. And there is no detrimental impact on access to visiting. The visiting guidance for hospital is clear. And again, we are encouraging our boards and hospitals themselves to take as generous an approach to visiting for inpatients as they possibly can, bearing in mind where the hospital sits, at what level in our strategic framework that hospital area is, and all the necessary precautions around booking for visitors and PPE and the other public health measures. In terms of access and testing for visitors in care homes, if Mr Rennie indulges me, I have a statement to Parliament on the Adult Social Care Winter Preparedness Plan in a very short period of time, and I think it is appropriate that at that point I advise all members of the position in that regard, as in other areas that I know he takes a keen interest in.
Thank you. And question number 5, Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of England entering lockdown and the Scottish borders being placed at level 2 restrictions, what measures are being considered to ensure that only essential cross-border journeys take place?
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, to suppress the spread of COVID-19, it is essential, with limited exceptions, there is no travel to or from areas where higher numbers of people may be carrying the virus, whether in Scotland or elsewhere in the United Kingdom. In the current circumstances, our guidance is clear. Nobody should travel from Scotland to England, nor to any other part of the UK, unless it is absolutely essential. The same applies to travel from any other part of the UK into Scotland. The reality is that we cannot police every single journey, and therefore must rely on people complying. That is why this is a good example of why it is so important to take the people of Scotland with us in all of our decisions.
Christine Graham.
I thank the Deputy First Minister for his answer. Make it plain that this is a public health, not a constitutional issue, given that travel from level 3 local authorities bounding the Scottish borders is prohibited, except for those essential journeys. Can I therefore ask whether the Westminster Government is engaging, I hope, in a mutually respectful manner with regard to preventing unnecessary cross-border travel from England into Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is engaged in discussions with the UK Government about issues in relation to travel within the United Kingdom and also international travel. We are essentially coming at this from the same perspective, that we all want to minimise travel and to discourage individuals from travelling, given the likelihood of the spread of the virus as a consequence. There are travel restrictions in place in England, which, if followed, would mean that journeys into Scotland would not be permissible in relation to the arrangements set out by the Prime Minister on Saturday, and the same guidance exists here in Scotland. So I assure Parliament and Christine Graham that the Scottish Government is engaging constructively with the UK Government on this important question to try to stop the spread of the infection.
Christine Graham.
Can I thank the Deputy First Minister for that answer? It's good to see that cooperation is welcomed. Can I ask, therefore, how cross-border travel can be monitored on the Scottish side and indeed prevented unless, and I stress, for essential travel, such as healthcare, work and caring responsibilities, and, for example, how Test and Protect would function people travelling from England into Scotland? Because without those safeguards, many of my constituents are concerned not only at COVID being imported from neighbouring council areas in Scotland, but additionally from England, with an even higher prevalence of COVID transmission.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there are a number of different elements in that question. First of all, there is a distinction between monitoring and policing. We are able to monitor the journeys and the volume of journeys that are undertaken from Scotland into England and vice versa through the Transport Scotland traffic monitoring system that is in place, which can give us a very clear impression about the volume of traffic that is making those journeys in both directions. As for policing, as I indicated in my earlier answer, it is impossible to police every journey, but we would appeal to members of the public to follow the guidance that is very clearly set out, that we do not want individuals, for example, in a level 2 area such as the Scottish borders, to travel to level 3 areas, whether they are in Midlothian or the city of Edinburgh or East Lothian, or whether they are south of the border in Northumberland or in Cumbria. And that advice is in place to try to minimise the spread of the virus. In relation to the Test and Protect system and the apps, we are involved, as Christine Graham will be familiar, the Scottish app is available to members of the public and is able to be utilised in other jurisdictions as well. We are working very closely with the United Kingdom Government to ensure compatibility between our app and the arrangements in place in England, and we hope to have progress on those questions in a short timescale.
Thank you. Rachel Hamilton, who also joins us remotely. Rachel Hamilton.
Essential services for my constituents south of the border, such as shopping or healthcare, or assisting a vulnerable person, or taking a dog to the vet in Berwick-upon-Tweed, are already subject to important exemptions, and indeed no different to travelling within Scotland to a Tier 3 local authority. Can the Deputy First Minister clarify if further exemptions will be added to enable my constituents to access lifeline services over the border, such as baby and toddler classes essential for the mental health and well-being of new mothers?
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, there's an interrelationship between the general issues on travel and the wider regulations that exist in different localities depending on the prevalence of coronavirus. And obviously the question that Rachel Hamilton raises will bring into effect the interplay between the arrangements for travel in Scotland and the availability of such classes or other provisions in Berwick-upon-Tweed or in any other locality. I think what I would say to Rachel Hamilton is that given the significant prevalence of the virus in south of the border, adjacent to the Scottish borders, where the number of cases per 100,000 in Northumberland is 190.7 compared to 43.3 in the borders, that there is quite clearly a risk of importation of the virus from these localities should there be any more than essential connections being made. I appreciate this is very difficult for individuals who live in localities where they have to access services in other jurisdictions, whether that's another local authority area in Scotland in a different level or in a jurisdiction south of the border. But I would encourage members of the public to err on the side of caution to try to minimise the spread of the virus, because we must all collectively and individually do everything we can to minimise the spread of the virus.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary and members. And that concludes topical questions. Point of order, Sarah Boyack.
In her answer to my second supplementary, the Cabinet Secretary gave us information on the wrong fund. I was asking about the £275 million fund for town centres, and the Cabinet Secretary inadvertently gave an answer in relation to the £230 million Communities Fund. I think the Cabinet Secretary is aware of it. If I could get a written answer to my question, I'd be very grateful, but I wanted that to be on the record. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Boyack. Thank you for that point of information. There is a corrections procedure, and I'm sure the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary, having been alerted, will use that procedure. Thank you very much. So that concludes